Today's event, the Marshall McKay Seminar for Empowering Native Knowledge, Perspectives on Native Art and Museums, will explore the significant changes that have reshaped museums and their relationships to Native history, culture, and art. This seminar is picking up on a symposium that was organized by the National Museum of the American Indian in 1995. The Changing Presentation of the American Indian, Museums and Native Cultures Symposium featured Native and non-Native scholars and museum professionals exploring issues concerning the representation of Indians and their cultures by museums in North America. A lot has changed in the 27 years since that symposium that will hopefully be addressed today. If I may take a few steps back to provide a bit of background for the topics that will be addressed. Native people have always wanted to tell their own story within a museum environment. Looking back several decades ago, and in some museums this is still the case, Native-related museum exhibitions were created with little or no input from Native people and or communities. I think we can all agree that this philosophy is generally no longer acceptable. It leaves out critically important voices and perspectives, does not facilitate an environment where Native folks have an authority on how the works from their communities are interpreted or used. And equally important, not working with Native people leaves out an important voice that is critical in the understanding of Native culture and history. I often use this example. When organizing an exhibition about women without involving any women, that certainly would not be acceptable within any context. This need for Native people to tell their own stories within museums date back as far as the Alcatraz occupation, October 20th, 1969. During this important event in Native history, certainly the first and one of the most important intertribal protests in the country, the group Indians of All Tribes created a proclamation that addressed their frustrations, concerns, and demands. It starts out, quote, "We, the Native Americans, reclaim the land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of all American Indians by the right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth," end quote. What is interesting about this proclamation is the last section of what they wanted to do with the island. I continue, quote, "Some of the present buildings will be taken over to develop an American Indian museum, which will depict our Native food and other cultural contributions we have given to the world. Another part of the museum will present some of the things the white man has given to the Indians in return for the land and the life he took. Disease, alcohol, poverty, and cultural decimation. Part of this museum will remain a dungeon to symbolize both those Indian captives who were incarcerated for challenging white authority and those who were imprisoned on reservations. The museum will show the noble and tragic events of Indian history, including broken treaties, the documentary of the Trail of Tears, the massacre of Wounded Knee, as well as the victory over Yellow Hair Custer and his army," end quote. This portion of the proclamation makes it clear that early as 1969, Native people were not happy with the way museums were depicting their culture. And to solve that issue, they wanted to present their own story in their own museum. The vision of creating their own museum and cultural center never panned out at the occupation, but the perspective continued. This theme of Native people telling their own stories resurfaced again in 1972 at the Walker Art Center, Minneapolis, Minnesota, when then director Martin Friedman insisted they organize a Native art exhibition that approached that approach this important area in collaboration with the Native community. The exhibition, American Indian Art, Form and Tradition, employed Ron Libertis to curate the exhibition. The gallery included Native-trained docents, a full slate of Native programming, and even a committee of local Native American community members to vet each work into the exhibition before it went into the gallery. Of course, this set the stage for important museums like NMAI, led by the vision of Rick West, which opened in 2004, and the First Americans Museum that recently opened. All of these efforts, some dating back 51 years, has made a profound impact on how we view Native museums, exhibitions, and the like. On a separate but equally important track is the development of tribal museums. These localized facilities tell stories from their own community through the community's eyes, and are on a parallel track and add the texture of reclaiming and redeveloping Native stories, history, and culture. It is through this lens that we need to approach today's sessions. Today, the panels will explore how Native curators are changing the museum narrative and the role of tribal museums. Tomorrow at the Autry Museum, the panels will include the interpretation of Native art and deep dive into California Native art. So with that, I would like to pass the podium on to President and CEO of the Autry Museum, Steve Aaron.
Thank you, and thank everyone for being here today. I want to join our speakers so far in extending thanks to, first, I guess, to all of the participants and all of those present here. But I guess I should start by thanking Joe Horsecapture, who may have forgotten to set his clock ahead back in March, but who has worked really tirelessly over the last months to organize this magnificent symposium, which is a fitting tribute to the life and legacy of Marshall McKay and to the work of empowering Native knowledge. So thank you, Joe. I also want to thank Lynn Valbuena for her opening remarks, which so perfectly summed up Marshall McKay's legacy to the wider world and also to the Autry Museum, where as a dreamer and a doer, he certainly played a key role, as Lynn elucidated. He played a key role in the revitalization of California Indian peoples in particular, and California Indian cultures. And as she said, he was certainly vital to the vitalization of the Autry Museum. Indeed, I think his imprint is very much on this facility that you're in right now. We'll have more to say about Marshall in particular tomorrow. Today, my principal charge is to introduce W. Richard West, Jr., whose very big shoes I aspire to fill, even though I concede I certainly will never live up to his sartorial standards, though I'm trying. I don't think that Rick West needs any introduction to any of the people who are in this room or likely who are on this Zoom. Rick is, as I think all know, a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, who, after a distinguished career as a lawyer, was somehow talked into becoming the founding director of the National Museum of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. And although he is now retired from his positions at the NMAI and at the Autry, he remains on the boards of numerous museums and other philanthropic organizations. And I should also add, though now President and CEO Emeritus at the Autry, he also continues to serve us as our ambassador to Native communities. Now, in his remarks today, Rick will focus on his tenure at the NMAI and on the transformations that Joe spoke about, on the transformations that Rick certainly helped to bring about across the landscapes of museums. At NMAI, to the consternation of traditionalist critics, Rick oversaw the upending of the customs and practices that had long governed the ways of museums, in particular in their relations with Native peoples and how they told stories about Native peoples. He oversaw in that sense a reset, a fundamental reset in the relations between Native peoples and the museums in which their creations were collected and exhibited. From that bully pulpit, Rick broadcast to the world a fresh and inspiring mandate about the principles, the purposes, and the possibilities of museums. I would be remiss, though, if I did not also at least say a few things about bringing the attention of the assembled here to the transformations that Rick West wrought at the Autry Museum during his near decade-long tenure at the helm. Here, he reaffirmed the commitments he made at the NMAI, again insisting, as Joe mentioned, insisting that Native communities be permitted to tell their own stories in their own voices. He also, and I think this remains fundamentally important here and across the museums, he insisted on that museums understand their place in the larger world, a place for civic and civil engagement, offering a forum in which, a quote that he likes to quote often, to a safe place to ask, to have unsafe ideas aired. And I think that idea certainly animates our proceedings today and tomorrow too, both in terms of the issues we take up, and as Rick would argue, in the civic, civil, and respectful form that we take on sometimes challenging issues. I think also if we're going to talk about Rick's legacy, it can begin also by just simply looking around this facility, which I hope we give you a chance to see a little bit more of at some point, because it is also a reflection of what Rick brought to here, and more broadly to, I think, the world of museums. I could go on about the signature exhibitions that occurred during Rick's regime, about the contemporary American Indian art collections acquired, about the vision of an intercultural institution that he implanted here. But Joe Horscapture told me to keep my remarks to 5 minutes. And as Rick will shortly note, one should always pay attention when given, quote, horse capture directives, unquote. So please join me in welcoming Rick West to the podium and thanking him for decades of dedicated work to, among many other things, empowering Native knowledge.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'll try to live up to at least 50% of all the nice things that you said about me. For today's presentation, as Steve just mentioned, I was given very, very specific instructions by Joe Horscapture. I never ignore Horscapture directives, as he also said, whether it be Joe's father, George, who was my mentor and museum practice muse when I directed the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, or more recently, Joe, here at the Autry Museum of the American West. Any museum director who indulges that misstep does so at his or her own risk, and I do not intend to start now, even in retirement. More specifically, Joe asked that I address, consistent with this symposium's focus on the empowerment of Native knowledge, the fundamentals of the transformative changes in museology and museum practices regarding the interpretation of Native collections and the defining presence of Native voice that have occurred in the past generation. I intend to do precisely that in the next several minutes by returning to the birthplace of my career as a museum director, the National Museum of the American Indian. Without claiming I believe too much, It was there that this concept of museology and museum practice, a truth in curating indigenous culture, first took place in the hands of a large national institution. Along with many other collaborators here in the United States and globally, the world of interpreting indigenous communities and their cultural art and patrimony has never been the same since. I would like to organize my presentation into 3 sections. First, I want to discuss the what of the key area of museum practice, namely epistemologies, a fancy polysyllable that refers to the substance of interpretive methodologies in museums, or in plainer English, who is doing the talking and is granted the authority to speak. Second, I want to turn to an even more important issue, the why of the what. Why does it matter that epistemological reform happens? Finally, what is the impact of the answers to the what and the why on the future and fundamental nature of this beloved institution we call the museum? To launch this trifecta of inquiry today, I need go no further than the words of my first boss at the Smithsonian, the then secretary of the institution. In describing his aspirations for the NMAI, Robert McCormick Adams delivered the following. "This is a national museum," he said, "that takes the permanence, the authenticity, the vitality, and the self-determination of Native voices as the fundamental reality it must represent." We move decisively from the older image of the museum as a temple with its superior self-governing priesthood to a forum committed not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of a multicultural dialogue. Remember these words because we will come back to them often in all 3 parts of this presentation. Let's turn first to the question of the what of contemporary museology and museum practice, with particular reference to interpretive and curatorial approaches. And an introductory note. The broader social and political context that birthed the mission imperatives of the NMAI were twofold. First, the NMAI in cultural origin and intellectual spirit was a potent adjunct of the multiculturalism movement that occurred in the United States in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In the museum community, this movement frequently assumed the institutional form of the ethnic-specific museum, and thus was born the NMAI. By stated mission, board policy, and programmatic design, its intentions were explicit from incipiency. The cultural authenticity and knowledge authority of Native peoples was to be encouraged, respected, and empowered. Second, the United States Congress also had stated in the NMAI's 1989 authorizing statute and its legislative history that Native America was to have a participatory and collaborative role in the National Museum of the American Indian. In other words, the various curatorial and scholarly foundations of the museum were to be profoundly mutual in shaping the substance of the institution. The cultural self-determination and cultural self-representation referred to in Adams' statement had thus been signaled explicitly, even if it sat, apparently, in a rather conventional place, a large Smithsonian museum on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. At the NMAI, museum practices rapidly transformed this framework from the conceptual to the actualized, long before programming of any kind became a reality in any NMAI facilities. A series of consultations, some 25 to 30 of them over a 2.5 to 3 year period, established the important guiding aspirations set forth in the museum's mission statement. First, the NMAI saw Native peoples and communities not as some ethnographic residuum in an advanced state of dotage or risk about to fall off the stage of history. To the contrary, Native America maintained a cultural present and would insist on a future, and hopefully a better one. Second, its presentation, interpretation, and representation of these peoples, cultures, and communities were premised on a consistent and systematic invocation of the first-person voice of Native peoples. These aspirations took form early in 1994 at the NMAI's George Gustav High Center in New York, and were implemented on a far larger scale when the NMAI opened in 2004 on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The process began with the organization of programming, including most specifically exhibits, not around collections per se, but instead around large ideas or themes that were based on those early consultations with Native communities. Native representatives from throughout the Americas were invited to participate in all exhibitions, from the selection of objects to the specific content of individual community installations within the larger frame of the transcendent ideas and themes. At the museum on the National Mall, this approach resulted in 24 specific installations representing Native communities from all of the Americas, 8 from Central and South America, 4 from the First Nations of Canada, and 12 from the United States. The process produced a museum with a very different look, feel, and content. Roger Kennedy, the late distinguished Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, in an essay regarding the opening of the NMAI, characterized what he saw in these terms. The point of it all, he wrote, is that the Indian Museum is a living Indians museum, presenting without rancor or unctuousness certain valuable truths about living Native persons, having a set of experiences special to them, but important to the rest of us. This place is different. We will not find labels telling us which dead artist did what, or why a dead object is thought to be pretty, or how it has been authenticated by some expert as, quote, culturally significant, close quote. Objects have been selected as they are in any good museum, because they are significant and because they enhance the significance of other objects with which they are juxtaposed. But at the end of the day, this is a companionable place where it is people who are culturally significant. Claire Smith, the Australian academic of Indigenous communities there, came to the same conclusion in more purely anthropological terms in her article for Art and Antiquity magazine entitled The National Museum of the American Indian, Decolonizing the Museum. This scheme of knowledge is given substance in the manner that objects in the collections of the NMAI are described in exhibitions. Deriving from indigenous conceptual readings of the world, she wrote, the classificatory systems of the NMAI reveal a holistic concern with the relationships between plants, animals, humans, and places, as well as between past and present. This is contrary to the non-indigenous classification systems, being based on neither the Linnaean system of linking similarities of features, nor the tradition of Cutter system of locating items in place, preferably adjacent to other items, sharing similar features. Smith's words provide the perfect segue for moving from the first part of this presentation to the second, the why of epistemological practices in museums that justifies changed approaches to interpretive and curatorial practices in 21st century museums. As introduction, we need to step back briefly to the origins of the very nature of museums and their knowledge systems that arrived in the United States from Europe. Born primarily of the Enlightenment and Western rationalism, museums have been driven in organizing and creating knowledge by the binary division of culture and nature. That dividing line resulted in the collateral creation of numerous subdivided disciplines, and to their being further split. For example, art and ethnography, art and culture, and history and art, as well as others. For the National Museum of the American Indian, the substance of the why was quite straightforward and quite a clear interpretive proposition, however complex its articulation might be. As a matter of knowledge systems, Native peoples of the Americas often see things in the world differently from Western interpretive paradigms. Ours is fundamentally, and always has been, a world seen whole, as correctly perceived by Professor Smith, and not seen divisible into the material and the non-material, the tangible and the intangible, let alone the subdivisions of disciplines that populate Western rationalism. Thus, from a native standpoint, the museum itself is no more important, and indeed probably less so, than the processes leading to its creation. It is those aspects of life and culture that speak more completely to the fullness, the totality, and the wholeness of living a native culture, traditions, songs, spiritual beliefs, and ritual and ceremonial practices. I believe that access to this dimension of native meaning requires the direct involvement of those who, in fact, live the culture. As Richard Curran, the former director of the Smithsonian Institution Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, emphasizes in his article, Museums and Intangible Heritage, Culture Dead or Alive, in ICOM News, museums must have an engaged, substantive partnership with the people who hold the heritage. Such partnership entails shared authority for defining traditions and shared curation for the representation. Museums cannot hide behind a history of elitism, ethnic or class bias that has afflicted the institution. Charged with the duties of cooperation and respect, museums will have to cross boundaries that have sometimes kept them, quote, above and beyond, close quote, the broader populace. They will have to recognize that knowledge exists in homes, villages, slums, out in the fields, in factories and social halls, as well as in the halls of academia and in their museums. This scholarship of inclusion and difference, this turning of the conventional interpretive paradigm on its head, however one wishes to characterize it, is not without implications. Specifically, it signals clearly the presence of new authoritative voices and an accompanying shift in interpretive and representational power relationships, as Professor Smith, previously quoted, points out. In deciding to create a museum in which Native Americans tell their own stories, unfettered by the interpretive lens of the dominant society, the NMAI has realized its potential to provide an unprecedented richness in interpretation and to offer rare insights into the lives of Native peoples. New vistas, directed by Indigenous eyes, are open to the public. The empowerment of new voices, she continues, however, also can involve a diminution of the authority of established voices. By widening the concept of authority to include the voices of Indigenous people, many of whom feel they have been silenced too long, the NMAI either intentionally or inadvertently, and I would have been happy to tell her which of those adverbs apply, challenges the position of non-Indigenous peoples as authorities on Indigenous cultures. And the National Museum of the American Indian learned very quickly, and often in triplicate, that such fundamental shifts sometime will not be taken lightly, particularly among critics whose museological paradigm emanates from the more conventional Western origins described above. When the NMAI opened in the National Mall in 2004, a critic at one of America's most august publications, the New York Times, expressed deep regret that the NMAI was moving away from the, quote, museum as a temple with its superior self-governing board, close quote, and a priesthood, and opined that it should have moved, quote, in the opposite direction, close quote. He opposed the museums making objects available to tribes, quote, for ritual use, close quote, believing that this kind of sensitivity constituted evidence of a, quote, studious avoidance of scholarship, close quote. He expressed open indignation about the specific choices made by the Tohono O'odham community of Arizona in one of the NMAI's opening core exhibitions, Our Peoples, when asked to describe the 10 most important events in their history. But Director Emeritus Kennedy, also previously quoted, was still alive and still writing, fortunately. In a retort and response to this particular critique that became its own legend, he analyzed this review in the following never-to-be-forgotten words. "The patronizing stench," he wrote, "emerging from that passage about the studious avoidance of scholarship grows stronger in another, suggesting that Indians' lack of, quote, detailed written languages," close quote, and Kennedy adds parenthetically, "sorry about that, all ye Aztec poets, and all ye Mayan historians and merchants," close paren, resulted from their having, quote, "so little to say," close quote. Compassionately, he would have us grant eternal silence to these mute fellow citizens, not only because they were lingo deprived, but because, quote, "so much trauma decimated the tribes," close quote. A little well-applied trauma might be helpful to shake that kind of self-assurance. If he had a sense of humor, Kennedy continued, a critic of this sort might be worth attending, even though tone-deaf to the numinous and colorblind to the symbolic. But what can you do with someone who can write with indignation of the Tanaho Odum's response when, quote, "they were asked to present 10 crucial moments in their history," close quote, and chose as their first, quote, "birds teach people to call for rain," and as their last, "in the year 2000, a desert walk for health." The Tohono O'odham refused to be talked down to. Their little parable says with a smile, "We will listen to the elders who have earned our respect, but we will not be patronized by puppies. I'm with them," concludes Kennedy. And as the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, so was I. I had an ethical and intellectual commitment to the simple, yet so fundamental proposition that Native peoples possessed important and authoritative knowledge about themselves and their cultures, past and present, and deserved to be at the Musiological table of interpretation and representation. I believe that the potential for new scholarship and insight into Native peoples and cultures at the NMAI was real and was to be valued highly, whatever the intervening and intermittent challenges along the way might be as we introduced new paradigms of interpretation, representation, and inclusion, and in the process, transforming a century of exclusionary epistemological theory and practice. I now would like to turn, as promised, to the third and final part of my presentation, namely the implications for museums and cultural institutions more broadly of the NMAI's transformative journey of the past 3 decades toward creating in a museum what I can only describe as wider social and civic space and place, which Steve referred to in his introduction. What I probably did not see clearly when I was a museum director novitiate, which did last a while, was the great interconnectivity and integration conceptually between the first and second parts of Secretary Adams' statement that I quoted earlier in this presentation. While the NMAI, to employ a metaphor, was banging on the door of conventional museum curation to grant entry to Native viewpoint and voice as authoritative, several substantial and significant consequences resulted, virtually ineluctably. From the standpoint of the Native interpretive and representational voice, collections were important, but hardly the entire story. As I emphasized before, they were considered most valuable by Native peoples as cultural keys and cues to themselves and to the communities in which both objects and people lived, past and present. The NMAI was in substance far more akin to a combined, quote, cultural center, close quote, and, quote, palace of collectibles on the National Mall. And just to hover for a moment, cultural centers by definition can be very different places. They are not one-time or single-purpose and solely cultural destinations, let alone cabinets of curiosity for the presentation of collectibles of material culture. They are broader places and wider spaces where the institution can connect with external interests that relate to the subject of the cultural center. In other instances, external interests may be using the center's physical and intellectual space as a gathering place for addressing matters of important relevance to the community that are unrelated to the specific aims of the cultural institution. In either case, the cultural center is an instrument and catalyzing adjunct to the community. A community center, however the adjective community may be defined, for engagement, conversation, debate, even controversy, but always, as the late distinguished American Musiology Steve Weil described it, a safe place for unsafe ideas. In practical and operating terms, this description is what I mean in using the phrase and the words civic space. I am confident that it was what Bob Adams intended when he referred those many years ago to the National Museum of the American Indian as a forum. In her paper entitled Choosing Among the Options, an opinion about museum definitions, my good friend, colleague, and mentor, Elaine Hoyman-Gurian, a gifted museologist in her own right, describes, among others, the model of the community museum in the following, and for the NMAI, instructive terms. Community museums look the least like museums and are often named cultural or community centers. They are often a mixed-use space of affiliated organizations and functions with a blend of meeting spaces, gathering spaces, and stages, offices, food service, and teaching spaces. There have been community-centered museums in many countries and over many decades. Tribal museums of indigenous people often concentrate on the societal needs of their people as their primary agenda. Eco-museums are a kind of community-centered museum started to preserve in living history fashion the work, crafts, and information known only to the elders of the community. Community-centered museums often make their objects available for ceremonial use and study as a matter of course. The markers of the National Museum of the American Indian as a cultural and community center and civic space, functionally, regardless of the name by which it goes, are abundant. The permanent exhibitions, a very conventional museum medium normally, themselves offer cues to the broader and different intentions of the National Museum of the American Indian. The exhibitions did contain objects, thousands of them to be exact, but they did not determine or define the installations in the usual customary way. Broad ideas and themes, Native peoples themselves, and the role of communities held equal sway, and the integration of all of the above in the presentation was key. The focus of the exhibitions, as well as the individual community, Native community components, were and remain diverse and address subjects as varied as Native cosmology, casino operations, health issues, urban Indian life, and hunting and fishing rights. Soon after the NMAI opened in 2004 on the National Mall, representatives of the Gwich'in Nation of Northeast Alaska and Northwest Canada quite literally set up a day camp across Maryland Avenue from the museum. Through loudspeakers and the distribution of written information, they lobbied any passerby, including numerous visitors to the NMAI, willing to listen, regarding their staunch opposition on religious and cultural grounds to the legislation then pending in the United States Congress concerning the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I applauded their choice of a protest site, and in some ways what I appreciated most, perhaps somewhat ironically, is that they were not invited. The Gwich'in chose us as the site to unfold what I regarded as a potent formula for transformation, the passionate expression of profound aspiration. What links these examples, exhibits directly undertaken by the NMAI, and Native activities external to the museum but still associated with us, is this: all intend to promote a broad civic discourse that is engaged, interactive, and mutually participatory regarding Native peoples and cultures of the Americas. Truly, the museum as forum in action. And so we now turn to the conclusion of our journey through the early mission intentions and aspirations of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, as envisioned and implemented almost a generation ago, with an eye on their relevance and pertinence in 21st century museology and museum practice. How do we measure and assess the impact for purposes of what many in this room do with passion, commitment, and competence every day of their professional life as members of the nation's museum community? Here is what I will propose. The words are mine from the concluding paragraph of an article that appeared in the publication Museum International, addressing the question of the very definition of museums in the 21st century. The popular perception of these great institutions called museums is that they are principally cultural destinations, and very worthy ones, but somehow ultimately apart from society's mainstream. A delightful weekend excursion, but not a part of everyday life, over there, instead of sort of right here amongst us. These great and important institutions of art, culture, and history indeed are often brilliantly pleasant and inspiring stops on the cultural tour bus route. But they can be and should be far more than that in the 21st century. The substantial changes that have occurred in museum epistemologies and interpretive practices as they relate to the representation of cultural communities, and especially those that are indigenous, offer multiple possibilities and potentialities. I return to the visionary statement of Secretary Adams as he contemplated the future of the National Museum of the American Indian and its impact on museology and epistemological and interpretive practices. He counseled that this new institution should not fear departure from old and historical museum models like, quote, the temple with its superior self-governing priesthood, close quote. Adams urged instead that the museum embrace epistemologically, and to use his words, the permanence, authenticity, vitality, and self-determination of Native American voices as the fundamental reality it must represent. With these observations and envisioning, he suggests a path that has implications, possibilities, and potentialities for the future of many other 21st century museums and museum practices. His statement explicitly and implicitly rejects the older image of the museum and affirms the need for new models. First-person voice, in this case indigenous, and cultural self-determination in museum practice should be critical interpretive guides. Those voices constitute the fundamental reality that the institution must represent. The transcendent epistemological and curatorial practice message is that those cultural realities may differ from other cultural constructs, should be respected for being so, and are entitled to authoritative status in the museum's development, articulation, and interpretation of content and knowledge that its audiences see, hear, and experience. This transformation and approach also has direct impact going forward on the very nature of the museum as a public institution, not solely as a collections depot and temple of objects, but as a forum committed not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of a multicultural dialogue. We struggle in the 21st century and on a global basis to find and implement civic and social space, those gathering places for discussion, discourse, debate, even controversy, but always a forum and safe place for unsafe ideas concerning cultural history and human experience. But museums represent at least the opportunity as a notable chink in that contemporary armor of political and social polarities and the disabling cultural and historical gloom they engender. The museum is counterpoint, although not able to do everything, can do something, and a very important something. That hope and aspiration should be the intellectual, musiological, and moral and ethical aspiration of all museums, and how we define ourselves and our future in the 21st century. And on that journey, that worthy journey, I send all of you today on your way with these Cheyenne words of heartfelt encouragement. Namaheo, Najamevet Sem, Najamevet Hats Hutsa Ohes, Natsem Khan, Nida Hawaii Sepeva, Janishe, Eshevet. And in English, roughly translated, means Maheo, the great mystery, walks beside you and your work and touches all the good that you attempt. Thank you.
Would you take some questions? Sure. Okay. Anybody have any questions? I think I want to go here.
Rick, what do you think the future holds for, say, the National Museum of the American Indian? There's a transition in leadership, and there's certainly a recognition, I think, throughout the nation of the accomplishments of the museum. But what are the next steps for a museum like NMAI that you see anyways?
I appreciate the question. It's almost as if I planted it, but I didn't. But because it comes from the chairman of the board of my former employer, I listen very carefully. Here's what I think. It's interesting. The initial proposition of the NMAI sort of as historically an ethnic-specific museum, striving to make sure that in a systematic and consistent way, the first-person voice of the indigenous community was invoked, has been largely achieved as far as I'm concerned. I was very interested when Cynthia, the new director, who actually worked at the NMAI while I was the director, had an interview with the Washington Post, and the interviewer said something along the lines of, "Well, you know, when the NMAI opened up, it got kind of banged around a little bit in the critical community," and Cynthia said, "Well, I think that if you ask those same questions today, the response would be quite different, because the playing field has simply changed a great deal." Now, but to go on to your question, so what's the next step? If that is pretty much in hand, what then happens? And I think the NMAI has already signaled that. And it signaled that under my successor, Kevin Gover, who was also my former law partner, so we discuss things a lot and often. When he said, and which I was trying to do as I was leaving, that the NMAI was first of all about affirming to the Native community itself. It was kind of an internal effort to affirm to the Native community itself its own worth, its own place, its ability to speak about its own history and experience. But then the next step is somehow crossing out of that to become also have external connection. And so I think we were already beginning at the end of my tenure at the NMAI to go to that step. And that is when because that is really the consequence of treating this as civic and place and space, is that you're not just talking to the Native community, but is the Native community in conversation with other communities. But it's a different kind of conversation because you have new voices of authority at the table doing some of the talking. And so that is the next step. And what's interesting to me is that at the time, I was still the director of the National Museum of the American Indian. One of my board members, before he became the director of the African American Museum, was Lonnie Bunch. And Lonnie Bunch and I had long conversations about this very subject. And Lonnie Bunch was of the view that the museum that he opened up was not just a museum of African American history, it was a museum of American history. And everybody should understand that. And in a way, the NMAI is a description in our own voices of our own history, but it is also a story of American history. And so it is that enlarged step, I think, that needs to be taken, where it encompasses, even beyond Native communities, a broader dialogue that speaks across cultural and historical boundaries.
Okay, any more questions from the audience?
Thank you, Jim Pepper Henry, First Americans Museum. And I worked for Rick for 10 years at the National Museum of the American Indian. And obviously you have an incredible legacy, but things that I think people should know about you and your leadership is that you trained a whole generation of young Native people to work in the museum profession. I wouldn't be where I'm at today without the training that NMAI provided under your leadership. And I also think a huge part of your legacy is what happened with repatriation and pushing the envelope and really being the framework for the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act. I'd like for you just to make a few comments on those two things, because that's an important part of your legacy and the legacy of the National Museum of the American Indian.
Yeah. I would have to say that if I'm looking back and trying to assess legacies, that the first point you make is the one that I value the most in a way, because I can even look out at this audience and in all kinds of places see brown faces that would not have been there 30 years ago at the NMAI. They simply didn't, they just didn't exist at that point. And that is part of the change. I mean, it is we did our best at the time at the NMAI to sort of put that in motion and to be sure that we were creating leadership for the future, if you will. And again, as I say, if I were tallying up the legacies, that's one that I value the most and that makes me the happiest, is that is the case. I see Native curators, I see Native museum directors, et cetera, are all over the place now. And this includes not only in community institutions where it existed to begin with, but even in other even in larger institutions that sit elsewhere and major positions of leadership. And I just think that is something that I value very highly. Repatriation, it is interesting because I think there is a tendency sometimes on both sides of the proposition for both the Native community and the non-Native museum community to look at repatriation almost too literally. If you look at it literally, it's of course important on that basis because it required the return under legally defined, statutorily defined standards of certain materials where Congress decided that under certain circumstances and in light of certain proofs shouldn't be in museums to begin with. You have human remains and funerary materials, and that's kind of a matter of moral redemption, if you will. They should have never been there, quite frankly, in museum collections. But if you're dedicated to, if you look at Native peoples as a living culture, then there are other things that also shouldn't be there that speak to ceremonial practice, spiritual life, etc. And so the literal provisions of that act are very important, but what I think is sometimes missed is the fact that there was a huge shift that occurred in the power relationship between Native communities and the museum world as a result of the Repatriation Act. Because if you really think of it and you accept what is on the face of the Repatriation Act, it has very close linkage to the subject I talked about, namely the invocation of Native voice in interpretation and representation of Native people in exhibits and programming in museums. That's all part of the same package as far as I'm concerned. And so repatriation had literal impact, and then it had a ripple impact in sort of turning the relationship that had existed between museums and Native communities on its head. And Native communities occupy a place in museum practice that they did not occupy before, even apart from the literal provisions of the Repatriation Act. And they simply have much more authority and authenticity in museums at the present time as a result of that shift in the fundamental power relationship.
I always, to Jim's question, I always like to say that, although I'm not a big fan of this term, I always like to say that Rick did decolonization before decolonization was cool. Is there any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thank you very much.